Chapter 8. Origin and Conservation of Life Force. It is now a well-established principle in philosophy that all life is a force, and it is equally certain to the intuitive reason that all force in the universe is a manifestation of some primal life, some central living power, call it by what name we may. We may consider it a fundamental truth that life is a spiritual force, and not, as formerly supposed, a fluid, but it is a force different from the ordinary forces of the physical universe. It is now admitted that all force is indestructible, though it may be changed into other forms of manifestation, and this constitutes the highest scientific evidence of the immortality of man. The grand source and central fountain of all physical energy is supposed to be the sun. Here is the origin of all motion on the globe we inhabit. Take that away, and universal darkness, stillness, and death would be the result in the physical world we inhabit. All the movements of nature would cease at once, the streams would no longer flow, the tides would come to a perpetual pause in their inward and outward motions, the successions of the seasons and the alternations of day and night would come to an end. And all the 100,000 species of plants would perish, and Byron's dread picture of a sunless world, in his poem of darkness, would be a realized fact and not a fancy. Scientific men have felt the need of some central spiritual power that should sustain the same relation to the souls of men that the sun holds to the material world. On this subject, Professor Trowbridge remarks, looking, therefore, at the problem of life and mind from a purely scientific point of view, we seem to require a source from which can come the principle of life, and which can create moral and intellectual growth in suitable soil and under fitting conditions. In case of the energy derived from the sun's heat, we have a cycle of operations in which there is no annihilation of force. If we grant that there is a source of life and mind independent of mere chemical changes produced by the sun's heat, and if we adhere to the notion of the conservation of force applied to this principle of life and mind, we are led to adopt the idea of a cycle of operations in which there is no annihilation of spiritual force. The doctrine of the existence of the spirit after physical death seems to me not to be foreign to the scientific ideas of the conservation of force, which have now obtained such complete supremacy in the science of physics, or to the doctrines of Darwin, which are accepted by so large a body of eminent naturalists. Without the sun, there would be an annihilation of force. When energy is dissipated, we find the sun exalting it again by processes which we cannot completely follow. The idea of a great source of life and mind, the prototype of our physical sun, which sets in motion a vast scheme for the survival of the fittest and the exaltation of energy in vast cycles, is not inconsistent with the doctrine of the New Testament, and seems to be required in a philosophical theory which shall endeavor to account for the differences in that great spiritual world which are continually suggested to the human mind by the various types of mental growth. Popular Science Monthly, April, 1877. This primary and exhaustless source of life and spiritual energy we have in the sim of the spiritual world, as described by Swedenborg in the treatise on the divine love and wisdom. Poe affirms that the proximate emanation of the divine essence assumes to the inhabitants of that realm of life the form of a sun, and that it sustains the same creative relation to that world that our solar orb docks to its planetary system. This is one of the original conceptions, or revelations, of Swedenborg, in which, under a modification of language, is being adopted by scientific men. The solar radiance and the sun above the sun, which are favorite expressions of the Reverend Joseph Cook in his lectures on the relation of science and religion, are borrowed from the Scandinavian seer. From this one source come forth all life and spiritual force, and all creations. No life can perish, because it is uncreated, and is eternally supplied from this central fountain. Can we have access to it, and come into voluntary receptive communication with it? It is the source of all inspiration of life and light in the souls of men, and what is called the word of the Lord that came to the prophets, and the Holy Spirit in the system of the Christ, are modifications of it. We see its most intense form of reception in the transfiguration of Jesus on Mount Tabor and in the shining of the face of Moses. In fact, we are never sundered from it, for it is to us the light of life. If we can say with Whittier, "And all the windows of the soul I open to the sun," we may come into a conscious appropriation of its life and light. The existence of God and his ceaseless influence is as necessary in science and philosophy as it is in theology. Every scientist can say of science as Robespierre said of France, "If there is no God, we must make one. France cannot do without God." Professor Lionel S. Beale, one of the highest authorities in the use of the microscope in histology and physiology, in his theories of vitality and religious thought, says that all vital power affects the molecules of matter. and makes them take up certain positions, and so arranges them that certain definite combinations shall take place. This vital power is capable of causing the particles it guides to be so arranged as to form at length complex, and it may be very elaborate, structures, performing the most delicate work, and in a most perfect manner. All this, as I, too, Fichte has demonstrated, is affected by an unconscious, or, as he calls it, a preconscious, mental action, a subject we shall have occasion to discuss hereafter. Beale affirms that mental action is the highest manifestation of vital power of which we have any cognizance, and that it is reasonable to conceive that the highest form of vital power of which we have knowledge and experience is in some way closely related to the deity. This is only a reproduction in other language of the doctrine of Paul L. that in him we live, and move, and have our being. One thing is certain, that the vital functions are performed without any conscious volitional effort on our part. A state of unconsciousness and of perfect passivity is not necessarily, and as a matter of fact, a cessation of existence and of mental activity. We still live. In a dreamless sleep, and in a trance, we are unconscious of the external world, and have no voluntary control of the bodily organs, and yet we are alive. The spiritual principle and force that animate the body, and are the spring of all its vital activity, still move the physiological machinery with undeviating regularity and with an unerring intelligence. Something beside our own conscious intelligence and a vital activity not under the control of our individual will, a higher life in our personal existence, must then reside within us. And there must be some power distinct from our volitions that executes these important functions. Call it by what name you please, we will not dispute about words. It will ultimately refer itself to our connection with the divine being, the common life of the universe. The primary movements of the body, and those on which all others depend, viz., respiration and the action of the heart, are for the most part involuntary and unconscious movements, yet they take place according to a fixed law, and are under the guidance of intelligence. The force that creates and maintains these movements must lie in the preconscious region of the soul's activity, and this must be related most intimately to the divine life. It is the nature and property of spirit to produce motion, and of matter to receive it. Dr. Darwin says, I am ready to allow that the ultimate cause of all motion is immaterial, that is, God. It is a truth that science in the future will be compelled to recognize, that we live in God and He in us. Yet the more closely we are consciously united to God, the more real becomes our own life, and the more distinctly defined to our perception is our own individuality. For as God has life in Himself, so He gives to us to have life in ourselves. In His infinite love, in the exuberance of His goodness, He imparts life to us so freely and fully that it requires an effort to make it seem otherwise than a self-originated life of our own. Creation is a genesis, or begetting, and the life of the Creator is prolonged, extended, multiplied, and manifested in the beings that go forth from Him. The primary meaning of the word creation, in all languages, is that of an act of generation. It seems to be deeply embedded in the consciousness of mankind that creation is a genesis or begetting. Hence the first book of the Pentateuch of Moses, though without a title in the Hebrew, was named by the Septuagint translators Genesis, from Yevdah, to procreate, because it was supposed to give an account of the creation of the world and of man. In the preface of the Johannine Gospel, where it is said that all things were created by the Word, or the divine thought, the verb is ilrogi, to be born, as creation is represented as a birth. The Audiobook bara signifies not only to create but primarily to bring forth, to give birth to. The Saxon word beget signifies not only the generative act, but more literally to cause to exist. That the generating principle of creation, or that which causes all things to exist, or come to a manifested being, is the divine word or thought of God as clearly stated in the Scriptures. It is also recognized in common language in the use of the word conception. To conceive signifies not only the vitalizing of an ovarian germ, but also to form in the mind, or to think. In pneumatology, or the science of spirit, when we have a sensation of an object, the idea which is awakened is called a perception. When the same object is presented to the mind in thought, it is denominated conception. It is then a spiritual genesis, a mental procreation. By thought we beget it, that is, get it to be, or cause it to exist. But in both cases the thought is the inmost reality of the thing, and is all that of which the mind knows anything. For, as Plato taught, the only objects of knowledge are ideas. God conceived the world, or generated it from Himself, by thought, and a thought is never disconnected from the mind that thinks. When a thought assumes an outward form, so as to be conceivable by the mind, It is a word or thing, which, in the Hebrew language, are one and the same. Plato and Hegel both agree with Swedenborg in making the word or thought of God the veremost reality and the veremost essential in the universe, or, as the latter expresses it, the very real itself or the very essential itself of the universe, where the idea struggles to find an appropriate form of outward expression. The inmost ground of all beings and things is divine. It is what is called in the first chapter of Genesis, in the first chapter of the Johannine Gospel, the beginning, the first principle, or proximate outgoing of the divine life. This principle is the inner essence of all things, because they have the radix of their being in God. Their taproot extends downward to the divine essence and springs from it. Consequently, all souls, as to their inmost self, finding their immediate principle, beginning, or ground of existence in God, are consubstantial with Him, and also with one another. In and from this first principle God created and ever creates the world and all that is in it. Or, as it is in the Latin Vulgate of the first verse of Genesis, in principio crevit Deus, in the beginning God created, which has no reference to time. He creates all things in this first principle by the word, or express thought of the divine mind. This word, as it was represented by the Christ, is the beginning of the creation of God, or that which is the beginning and substance, or underlying reality, of all things. Because all things are manifestations of this one principle is the reason why all are as one, and the state of the least affects the whole, or as Whittier, in his Quaker of the Olden Time, says, with that deep insight which detects all great things in the small. He knows how each man's life affects the spiritual life of all. In the system of Hegel, the underlying reality of all existence, or that from which all manifested being springs, is the divine reason. By him reason is viewed as substance as well as infinite power, underlying all the natural and spiritual life it originates, or that by which and in which all reality has its being and subsistence. It is the infinite energy of the universe. It is the infinite complex of things, their entire essence and truth, which amounts to about the same thing as Swedenborg's doctrine that God created all things by the divine truth. See Hegel's Philosophy of History, Bin's edition, pages 9, 10. In the Philosophy of Schopenhauer, or in his great work, World and Will, this underlying principle of existence is will, but will as a force unconscious of itself, and separate from a divine personality, which makes it atheism, which he openly professes. By a misunderstanding of Buddhism, which Ho accepts as the oldest and best religion, his system is an idealism that leaves out God. For as there is in the universe only the all and the nothing, if you subtract God from it, there is nothing left. In Hartmann's philosophy, he gives to the force that originates and actuates the world and all things in it the indefinite name of the unconscious. This includes both will and intelligence, but acting blindly, and, as it seems, separate from personality, which is a contradiction and impossibility. In the system which I adopt, the logos, the word, the divine thought, is that which creates and governs all things, in the universe as a whole, and in its parts is a manifestation of it, and a permanent expression of it. In a way analogous to this, when an artist thinks or imagines a landscape, it is an ideal and real creation of it, and lacks only a permanent expression on the plane of sense which God gives to his creative thoughts.